Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Douglas Valentine. We're going to discuss a recent book of his that he published in 2016. The title of that book is The CIA as Organized Crime: How Illegal Operations Corrupt America and the World. But he's a prolific author. He's written other books. Maybe his most known book is The Phoenix Program, America's Use of Terror in Vietnam. He's also written The Strength of the Wolf, The Secret History of America's War on Drugs, and also The Strength of the Pack, The Personalities, Politics, and Espionage Intrigues that Shaped the DEA, or Drug Enforcement Agency. And many of the topics that seem to be covered in those books also are interwoven through the book I read, which is, again, The CIA as Organized Crime. And it's about how generally intelligence corrupts and is also involved in the drug war and how it all interweaves together. But Douglas Valentine can talk more about that. His website is douglasvalentine.com. There's a wealth of information with links there. And he's also published a poetry anthology. Maybe he can read a poem after the interview if he'd like to. But that is Douglas Valentine, Poems of the New American Century. So Douglas Valentine, are you there?
Thanks for having me on your show. I hope I can contribute something of, value to people, something new.
Well, I think so. I think that I found that your writing and the information included in there is information that you'll never find on the American corporate media. So it was refreshing for me to look and see some of the other information that, I've seen in other recent books I've read. And so it's really a delight to have you on the show. For people who don't know your name or background, can you talk a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in writing on these various subjects, please?
Well, I'm 69, so I'm a boomer, okay boomer now, everybody says that. And I went to college during the Vietnam War. But I wasn't political. My interests at the time were, more in studying literature, mythology, and those are the things that interest me. And I wasn't very political. And I pretty much was not political. And my interests were in language, literary criticism. I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't have a story to write. And then in 1981, my father, who had been a World War II veteran, and who I was at odds with, we had a very back in those days it was called the generation gap. The fathers and sons were all at each other's throats, and there was this big communication gap. Anyway, we hadn't spoken in 10 years, and he said, "Come home, I have a story to tell you." He had just had his second open heart surgery. And he told me about his World War II experiences, which had traumatized him and had made him an abusive father. And his doctors told him if he wanted to heal from his second open heart surgery, he had to expiate all that trauma from the war, and which had been, turned him into a pressure cooker, a guy who engaged in corporal punishment and had all these illusions about what it means to be a man and manliness. And so my father and I reconciled. And he admitted that all the problems of communication that had existed between us were his fault. And this was something very unusual for a father and a son to go through. I'm one of the few people I know from my generation who actually had this kind of a cathartic reconciliation with my father. And anyway, it also resulted in my first book, The Hotel Talk Loban. So I had this kind of magical experience, which, fulfilled my desire to become a writer, and at the same time gave me deep insights into what it means to be a soldier and how that impacts modern society. and family relationships in a way that you can only come to understand if a man who's been through that goes through a personal transformation and actually expatiates all this guilt and anger and all the illusions that he's been operating under and comes clean. And so that was a really transcendent experience for me. And it also fit into my understanding of what's called the myth of the hero, of an individual having to go through a journey, a mythological journey through the underworld to confront his own demons, to come out at the other end as an enlightened, self-aware human being. So I began to see everything that happened, both in politics and society, through this lens. And I wanted to write a book about the Vietnam War. So I started kicking around for a subject to write about Vietnam, something that would involve me in some of these same subjects about the trauma of war. My father, his unique World War II experience involved a military cover-up, and he had been forced to sign a non-disclosure statement saying that he would be tried and executed if he ever told what happened in the war. So there was this added element of a veteran having to carry a secret that was part of it. And so I wanted to know if there were Vietnam veterans who were experiencing PTSD, the same thing that my father went through because of secrets, a big secret they had to carry with them. And somebody referred me to the Phoenix program, which was the CIA's program of actually directing soldiers, American soldiers, against civilians, the civilians who formed the infrastructure, who were the administrators and political organizers of the insurgency in South Vietnam. And these people were civilians, and they were protected by the Geneva Accords, the Geneva Conventions. But this was the beginning of modern warfare, of directing soldiers against civilians. And this was pretty much the nature of what happened in Vietnam, was that American soldiers didn't find themselves fighting like Nazis in France. They found themselves fighting guerrillas in their own villages, other than the guys that were fighting the North Vietnamese army up north. A large part of the war found American soldiers fighting civilians. And it was this whole thing that changed the way Americans think about themselves and what warfare is. And anyway, so it became a fascinating psychological subject for me to get involved in. And in the course of that, I interviewed dozens, if not hundreds, of CIA officers, because I had the head of the CIA at one point, a guy named William Colby, who previously had run the Phoenix program, liked my book about my father, the Hotel Top Loban, and he thought to himself, well, Valentine will understand the pressures that CIA officers and American soldiers were under in Vietnam. And
that kind of gave you...
And to some extent, he was right, and I was able to win the confidence of these CIA officers and soldiers because I did understand what it means to be a soldier and the kind of traumas that soldiers go through. But what they didn't expect was that, my father was like an advisor to me while I was writing this book, and he said, I would never do that. I don't know any soldier who would go out and torture and kill civilians. It's something different. So what was it all came down to the power of language that was cultivated during the Vietnam War to convince Americans that killing civilians in faraway countries was okay. And that is the crux of the Phoenix program. And again, it was my being able to, having a background in mythology, literary criticism, actually studying words and their meaning and their symbolic meaning, that gave me insight into what was going on. And I began to see that the CIA's power and the military's power resides totally in its ability to propagandize the American public and to make them believe a story. And then the American citizens who are just inundated with military propaganda and also CIA propaganda through the beholding media, which the CIA is hand in glove with. They're virtually, and for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable, the media and the CIA. They represent the same upper class interests. They're not out to create a better society, or it's not a social welfare program. The media or the CIA. Their interests are in grabbing the natural resources in foreign countries and making Americans think that this is something that they need to do for their survival. So all these things came together, which enabled me to do something that nobody else had ever done. Which was interview hundreds of CIA officers and actually explain what was going on in their minds and in the government's mind to create this perfect storm of disinformation and misinformation, which sort of results from the war, very much results from the war on terror and the events of 9/11 that we're witnessing today in the United States. This absolute total confusion on the part of people, unless they're absolutely totally partisan, and unless they absolutely totally believe that the Democrats are right, or they totally believe that the Republicans are right, or if, like Rick Perry said yesterday on Fox News, that although an imperfect human being, God and Jesus have chosen Trump, and he's the chosen one. You got to be pretty crazy to believe that kind of stuff. But 40 million people in the United States believe it. And how does it end? How do you get to a point where the people in a democracy can believe this stuff? And not only that, then there's other people who watch MSNBC and think that everything they're being told is perfect fact. So we live in, what's often called the post-truth world. And everybody who's got a brain is at a disadvantage. And anybody who's trying to think critically about these things and is not a true believer in one faction or the other faction finds themselves in a quandary, and they don't know where to get facts anymore. And it's become a virtual, it's become what that guy, I can't remember what his name is right now, but he had a website called Info Wars.
Oh, Alex Jones. Alex Jones. Alex Jones.
Yeah. But it is, and that's what's going on. And what it was all this perfect storm of people not knowing what's a fact and what's a fiction has just exploded because of the internet, right, and social media. And now there's actually, it's like there's a Gordian knot and nobody can untangle it. And so, what I try to do in sort of flailing about way is to try and explain how we got to this point and try to point some way out of it.
Right. So, and I think that one of the interesting aspects of your book is you show how the Phoenix program the influence of the Phoenix program has seeded itself through American internal and external policies.
Yes, and it's this whole, it's philosophical in a way, and I won't overload your listeners with philosophy, but there was a guy named Hegel who had this theory, there's a thesis and an antithesis, and you end up with a synthesis. And if you have a foreign policy, which is secret, basically, in the modern world of the internet, well, that eventually, which if you consider that as a thesis, and you have a antithesis, which is of people in America who have domestic policies, which they call democracy and freedom, as opposed to the sort of horrible things you have to do overseas to preserve that freedom. Well, eventually you end up with a synthesis in the modern world of the internet. When it's a global world, those overseas policies come back home. And this was the thing I said, that Phoenix had come home to roost. And pretty soon you start seeing these sort of counterinsurgency programs that are used against people overseas, basically in the interests of the rich political elite, you find them being used at home as well. And in the United States, that was manifest with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security right after 9/11, where all the sort of counterinsurgency programs that were being waged overseas came home. And now they're being waged against the American people. And again, the most powerful weapon at the government's disposal is information. It's information warfare. And, you can just see it around you every day. And it's just magnified with 9/11, where people are just totally barraged with all sorts of information telling them to support the exact same people who are oppressing them. The soldiers who are standing in airports, railroad terminals and all the Patriot Act. We have to surveil everybody in the United States in order to make sure that nothing goes on. And
Right.
all of a sudden, everybody believes that Big Brother is a hero. And
Right.
again,
Right, it's necessary, right? Your enslavement is not these ideas are necessary for your protection.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the things that were happening in ancient Greece when the rich political elite in ancient Greece paid Homer to write stories about Achilles and his conquests of Troy, in which warriors are glorified. And every American male is brainwashed from the time he's very young to think that being a soldier on behalf of the empire is the greatest thing he can ever do. And so if you grow up in the 9/11, in the World War II, as a post-war baby boomer, or you grow up during the Vietnam War, or if you grow up after 9/11 and you're a man or you're a woman and you're told to support that man, your culture is telling you that you have to be a soldier, that you have to fight and kill and do all these things to preserve, your own safety. And so your little kids can go to school without somebody walking into the school with an AR-15 and blowing everybody away, which sort of, then they have to sort of explain, well, how that's happening. It becomes a dichotomy with all the violence in our society. Well, how do you explain that away? Well, it's all the result of this myth of the warrior hero, which just permeates our society and which is essential, absolutely essential, to furthering the interests of the warrior, of the rich political elite. And nobody has ever symbolized and represented that sadistic, bullying ideal of the American man than Donald Trump. He is the personification of them. He treats women as sex objects, which is what any soldier does overseas. You rape and you pillage, and that's what happens. And so he's brought this super toxic masculinity into the American discourse as the absolute ideal of what American men should be, and which is why you have biker gangs and military war and war criminals and any kind of abusive male supporting him to the nth degree. It's why I can't remember what they call them. Those some boys, fascists, all flock to him as well because he represents this ideal, and he's telling everybody, this is hooked up to. We have to put a border up along the Mexican border to protect us, and it feeds on everybody's paranoia. And it gets down to this, again, this essential contradiction that defines our discourse today, where you now have a whole group of people saying that, well, Trump is fighting the deep state. And it's become left equals right, and where he actually, more than any other individual hitherto, is representing the interests of the deep state. And
in a lot of ways.
And pitting American against American.
No doubt.
And so how do people understand this? Well, in order to understand this deeply at a level that begins to initiate any kind of change, everybody has to go through the same sort of cathartic experience that my father and I went through when he was able to transform himself and heal me as a result. Okay?
Right.
To say to you, well, it's not your fault. You were just a kid. What do you know? It was me, the adult, who was furthering all these myths that are essentially self-destructive and untrue. So, everybody, if they want to get out of this mess of what is real and what isn't real, has to start dealing with basic truth, the most basic truths of what are your assumptions. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean, if you look,
but it's the hardest thing in the world to do.
Well, I would agree.
We're in this gridlock.
Well, I would even argue that this whole country, the U.S., has probably been at war 200 years out of, the 250 years that it's been in existed. Right? The U.S. has constantly been at war.
Yes, and this, I've written about it at length. This is the American myth that we had to, that Columbus was the Christ bearer, and he was bringing enlightenment to the lesser people, and so that everything he did was basically okay because he civilized the continent.
The savages, right? Yeah.
All these sorts of things that Trump, again, epitomizes is the idea that, well, there are inferior people and blacks are inferior people. That's, we brought them here from Africa. So what if we, enslaved them? We were giving them an opportunity. It justifies every horrible thing that America has ever done. And the westward expansion, the carving out of all the borders. But most of all, the thing that's ingrained, I said, in all American men and the women who enable them and rely upon them in any sort of way. And, even to some extent, Fiona Hill can be seen to be a representation of this ideal of the warlike man. And what's interesting to see so many women flock to her as an example of the angry woman, who's standing up to angry man as somehow an example of this sort of imperial take no prisoners personality that actually defines what it means to be an American. I mean, it imbues women in this country as much as it imbues men as an idea. And yet at the same time, you pit men against women. A guy like Trump can do that and keep everybody from actually going through the hard work of reconciliation. And overcoming this myth as it is and what it's done to all of us.
Well, right. I mean, why are these imperial wars still continuing? Why are we still in Afghanistan? Why are we still in Iraq? What's going on in Ukraine? What's going on in Syria? Why are all these foreign conflicts? Why are we still involved in this? I mean, Afghanistan's honestly almost close to the opposite side of the globe from us, and we're still in there fighting wars that are similar to Phoenix, right? So the Phoenix...
Yeah, it's all economics. It's basically all economic reasons to enrich a certain segment of the American public. But it's also that a projection of this same myth.
Right. So it's the myth.
It's what drives the American psychology. Okay, that there's so many things going on at once.
Right.
But just getting back to this myth, if I can, for a minute.
Sure, go for it.
And then I'll get to your question. But after the United States finished conquering the American continent, which is at the end of the 19th century, okay, and we now have our borders that we see today. This expansionism never stopped, okay? Then we go to the Spanish-American War, and we recover the Philippines. We colonize the Philippines, and then there's
almost Cuba.
Sort
we
of
almost took Cuba.
Isolationist policy, but at the same time, the Council on Foreign Relations is urging the United States to get involved. And anyway, by the end of World War II, we have military bases all around the world, and we're occupying countries. We're occupying occupying Germany, we're occupying Japan, and we're beginning to become involved in the politics of countries all around the world.
Korea, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, not only that, we swing the elections in France, we swing the elections in Italy. The CIA is now beginning to manipulate, as part of this ideal that the whole world should be made into America.
Right.
We're manipulating political and social movements in countries all over the world, and we're doing it clandestinely through the CIA. And in the meantime, we set up, which has now become 800 military bases around the world in order to police the countries that are now under our hegemony.
Right. We're involved in Hong Kong, too. This whole Hong Kong conflict, the U.S. is supporting stuff, and Trump just signed an agreement to support Hong Kong. I forgot the title of it, but, it's still happening. So it's not...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear...
Sorry, I was just saying we're also involved in Hong Kong.
Yeah, sure. It's the latest example of the color revolutions, only they're not using that threadbare cover story anymore, but in terms of Hong Kong, it started in March, the demonstrations, okay? And they took off on June 9th of this year. And on June 15th, Trump started his trade war with China. And just last week, Trump said, well, I will not support the Hong Kong democracy movement if you, China, cut a deal with me. So, it's the old 1-2 punch. It gives the United States propaganda to use here in the United States to hammer China. And at the same time, it puts political pressure on China to cut a trade deal that's favorable to the United States. It's a perfect example of what the CIA does all around the world. It subverts foreign countries. It manipulates their political and social movements. And at the same time, it adjusts the messaging so that back home it sounds like the United States is a force for freedom and democracy and doing good. And so all these things fit together seamlessly. And this is what almost happened in Ukraine, which I know you want to talk about.
Yes,
but
please.
Ukraine was an anomaly, okay? And the United States wars in the Middle East as a result of 9/11 were a game changer for Russia. Everybody knew that the United States, and it's been the same since 1917, when the Soviet Union was created, and the idea of worldwide communism and leftist movements began, okay? And the United States has been fighting first the Soviet Union ever since then, because the United States is dyed-in-the-wool capitalist country, and one can understand democracy as capitalism, okay? And people here do, philosophically. And so we've been fighting the Soviet Union since 1917. And then in 1989, the wall came down and the Soviet Union was broken up. And Russia became the repository of this war, of all the ideas of this war that had been going on in the United States, okay? And now it had become, and it's never a war of tanks and bombers. It's a war, it's a psychological war. It's a covert war.
Right.
And once the United States started, ringing Iran with military bases, once it took over Iraq, once it started fighting in Syria, the Russians realized our backs against the wall. We're next. The Americans are in Afghanistan. They have military bases in all the former Soviet republics. They're circling them. NATO is expanding. The former Soviet satellites are now all members of NATO. They're closing in on us, and that they had to make a stand. And they made that stand in Ukraine in 2014. The CIA and the Obama administration organized a coup there that they had been engineering for like 20 or 30 years. And finally, they managed to install an American-friendly government that was anti-Russian. And the Russians realized this is the line in the sand, and so they invaded Crimea, and they took over Crimea, and they annexed it as they said it's always been a part of the Russian Empire. Now we're just taking it back. There's like 70% of the people there speak Russian. It's really a Russian state, and so this is the reason that there's the dynamic of that's what's going on in Ukraine right now. All right, and as always, the Democrats and the Republicans, once Ukraine became under the American hegemony and a client state of America, the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting for who's going to get the oil contracts there. And what you see playing out between Trump and the Democrats right now is a result of all this history and all these different dynamics going on. And now it's come down to in the modern world, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party each trying to create a narrative to get people to believe that they're doing the right thing, when in reality, they're both equally guilty.
They're both in on it, right?
Of creating this situation and trying to exploit it, and they're both equally corrupt. And yet, what they, the whole idea that there's this, family feud going on detracts from, again, what's really happening and any chance for Americans to reconcile and to become whole and a part of a peaceful country that, is not always subverting foreign countries and at the same time propagandizing and destroying the health of its own people.
Right, and it's interesting in your book you talk about how these people are ostensibly well-meaning people like Pierre Omidyar and him actually being involved in Ukraine and financing, coordinating 40 NGOs and some of The Intercept and some of his...
well, I don't know that... that the Intercept was involved in
No.
Other than the point that the Intercept did not
say anything.
Stories about it for the last 5 years, figuring its billionaire benefactor, as having been a force behind it.
Right. Well, that's what I was trying to get to.
They say we're free to write about anything we want, but they don't write about that.
Right.
But he's just like Trump's an example of overt Americanism. American maleism. There's nothing subtle about the guy. Everything about Omidyar is subtle. Okay, he's more representative of the CIA deep state working to undermine foreign countries. And in this, billionaires have vested interests in foreign countries, and Omidyar wanted to, get his fingers into the Ukraine pie, and so he anteed up $500,000. I can't remember what year it was in. It was right around the time of this coup, 2014, to create an organization that actually focused all of the American private industrial interests with the official government interest into this one powerhouse organization that began to actually define and create the narrative that was being used to explain to the world, to Americans, to Ukrainians, what was happening there. And of course, it completely deflected any attention from any kind of mendacious or pecuniary interests of the American in Ukraine.
But wasn't that one of the reasons why they elected Zelensky, this comedian, as their premier, is because of the prior corruption and what was going on?
Oh, I don't know enough about it. There's books that have written, my publisher, Clarity Press, published a really good book about it a couple of years ago. About Ukraine. And
Flashpoint in Ukraine? Was it Flashpoint in Ukraine?
That's right. That's exactly what it's called. And that was basically chronicling what was happening there as it was happening. Okay, so anybody who's interested in knowing the details, which I don't know, and I only know it as a manifestation of these other things that I was talking about. Basically the war with Russia that's been going on since 1917, and clash of ideologies, and now this, the corruption that's endemic to both the Democrats and the Republicans, as they both say, bang, gotcha, and the other one goes, bang, no, I got you first. It's just this anvil chorus of, infantile slanders and smears that just totally occupies the imagination and time of American citizens.
Good point.
And while in the meantime, the corporations are stealing the world blind and preventing Americans from becoming fully conscious human beings. Fully conscious, healthy, happy human beings. If you keep them like dogs in a cage, of course they're going to bite at each other, and that's what's going on.
But don't you think that's part of the psychological operation? That's intentional.
Yeah, that's why I've said from the beginning that language is the most powerful weapon that the rich political elite wield over all of us.
Can I read a quote from your section on Ukraine, your chapter? It is, quote, "The CIA isn't conducting secret illegal actions around the world to bring class, gender, and racial harmony to America or encourage Palestinians and Jews to hold hands and sing Pepsi commercials together. The CIA is doing this on behalf of the Clintons and Bushes. They do it for Ahmed Yar and Bill Gates and George Soros and the people who rule us." So, anyway, we're almost at...
You try to sum up things. That's a sort of a summary paragraph.
Sure.
And I would, it's a pretty good summary paragraph, but at the same time, everybody's got to learn what's going on in historical, psychological, every different aspect of it. And the problem is that as long as you're struggling to make a living, you don't have time to do that.
Right.
So basically, you're assured that 50 million people are always going to vote for Trump. And you're assured that 50 million people are always going to vote for the Democrats. And it just becomes a gridlock, which, nobody can escape, and the only way you can escape it is at one individual at a time, and again, that's the hardest thing in the world to do, to transform yourself into a conscious, loving, forgiving, peaceful human being here in the United States.
Well said. That's a good way to end it. But before we wrap this up, do you mind reading a little bit of your poetry? Do you have a favorite poem available?
You mean from my own poetry?
Yeah, I think it's from Poems of the New American Century. Did you put?
Well, that was an anthology that I did it. That's not actually my own poetry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I certainly encourage everybody to get the book.
Okay.
But my poetry book is called A Crow's Dream.
Okay.
And it's based on the fact that do we have 5 minutes?
You have all the time you want.
Okay. Well, when I was 8 years old, I had a magical experience. I was a kid, and I was going to school, and I was wearing it was in the autumn, and I live in New England, and my mother stuck a red hat on me, a red wool cap, and a crow followed me to school, flying from tree to tree. And when I got out of school, it was still there, and it followed me back home. During the day, when I was a kid, when I was at school that day, it followed me running across the playground. And all the other kids went, "Whoa, why is this crow flying next to his shoulder?" And anyway, so I got home, and it followed me home. And the next morning, I woke up. To make a long, other things happened, but it was standing in the front yard waiting for me again. And my mother was there, and she was interested in it, but she had chores to do. And the crow looked at me, and it cocked its head. And I lived right next to the woods, on the outskirts of town. And this crow walked me up a path into the woods, and it would flap its wings every few feet. And as a kid, I was just focused on it, just like watching a hypnotist's watch. in front of my eyes. And I followed up this path, and pretty soon I was in a part of the woods I had never been in before. Okay. And the crow stood in the middle of a little clearing under a tree, and it's the autumn. And the air shook, and 1,000 leaves, yellow leaves, fell down all around me. And when I came out of the spell, the crow was gone, and I just stumbled home, kind of like blindly through the woods, and I found myself at home. And, it took me 25 years to figure out, what might have happened or what was going on. And when you're a little kid, you have secrets. You don't tell your parents everything. You have girly magazines. You don't tell your mother, I have girly magazines, or I have cigarettes, or something like that. And this was just one of those little kid secrets that I never told anybody. But it was also at the core of what defines me as a person. I always knew that there was something more going on in this world that meets the eye. And I wondered, why had the crow led me to this experience? Was it really just the red hat? What was going on? And I've been looking for the rest of my life for these kind of magical experiences. And it was one of the reasons I was actually able to understand my father, be able to talk to CIA officers in a deeply personal way, because I understood what intimacy was. I understood that this whole idea of intimacy, of being intimate with the world, was something that I learned from this crow, that we have to be intimately involved with nature and with the world to fully understand it in a way that is so intimate that it's hard to actually to talk to people about it. The way the most intimate things are that are going on with you, you tend to keep those things secret, and then so it becomes the duty of a writer who's going to try to make a better world to talk about these intimate things, intimate relations. And that if you can do that, people will respond to you, and we can respond to each other as individuals. So I wrote a poem sort of about all that. It's called Red Wing, and it's about becoming intimate all over again. Red Wing. The scene is always the same. I'm intruding in someone else's dream. Someone much older with white hair, pointing a stick at a bird in a tree. The moon, of course, is waxing. Icicles sweet with syrup drip from maple branches. Beyond the split rail fence, someone slips into the forest. It's always over too soon before I think it through, before I remember how to glide like the redwing without ceremony across the thawing fields.
Oh, I like that. That's great.
The whole idea is to get back to this state of innocence, this intimacy with the world that we once all knew as children. The radiance that was once so bright. If you read, the great poets, you remember that line. This is what we should be striving for as human beings. Amen. Not conquest, not war, but to find that goodness and that naturalness inside ourselves and inside everybody else.
Awesome. That's a great way to end it. Again, it's Douglas Valentine. The book we kind of roughly covered was The CIA as Organized Crime, How Illegal Operations Corrupt America and the World, published 2016. His website is douglasvalentine.com, and the anthology of poetry I referenced is Poems of the New American Century. Douglas Valentine, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure.